America is too much pro Israel. Then why did the US let Pakistan have nukes? Also, Israel wanted to attack the Kahuta base via India, Abdul Qadir Khan's base in Kahuta via India. Why would Israel want to destroy something that is supported by the biggest ally, the USA? This is a very interesting question. So, um, yeah, the US is an unconditional ally of Israel. No matter what Israel does, the Americans will support Israel. You can take out the USS Liberty and smash it to smithereens. It's okay. A bunch of US sailors are killed. Doesn't matter. The US will still support Israel. So now, so that is indeed the case. Now, what happens is that despite the US always being an unconditional supporter of Israel, the interests and agendas of the two nations can differ. So, the US, what happened in the 20th century is that the Indian government, the Nehru regime, veered very strongly in the direction of the USSR. So India kind of became a USSR vassal. It did, yeah. And once that happens, the Americans will be really alarmed, and they will try and play their own games and cultivate their own vassals in the region. And that's why they cultivated Pakistan as a vassal. So they turned Pakistan into a US vassal. They funded and financed Pakistani terrorism in Afghanistan and India, etc., for decades. We know that that's all old history. But they also ensured that when Pakistan's the scientist Abdul Qadir Khan stole nuclear blueprints and technology, etc., from Europe, the Americans looked the other way. They allowed this to happen, and there was some Chinese involvement also because the Chinese passed on some nuclear weapon technology which had been tested in Tibet, Lopnor, which apparently was a North Korean design. So the Americans, the Chinese, they collaborated, they colluded in turning Pakistan into a nuclear power. And you know that the Americans and the Chinese were on the same page after the visit of Nixon and Kissinger in the 1970s to China when Mao Zedong was still alive. And India and China were also not on good terms. So it made sense for them to collude when it comes to Pakistan. So they ensure that Pakistan becomes a nuclear power, a de facto nuclear power, or an undeclared nuclear power by the 1980s, maybe the early or mid 1980s. Okay, now, so Israel, obviously their eyes and ears are everywhere, and this alarms them. And the Israelis often do things that the Americans don't want them to do. And then they say, okay, now deal with it. So what the Israelis decided was that they would bomb. So in, I think, 1981, the Israelis had bombed the Osirak reactor in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And that destroyed Saddam Hussein's hopes and ambitions of becoming a nuclear weapons power, of Iraq becoming a nuclear weapons power. And now the Pakistanis were developing the Kahuta reactor. So the Israelis wanted to destroy that as well. So the Israelis talked to the government of India, Mrs. Gandhi's government, and it was decided that there would be Israeli planes that will take off from India, maybe from Jamnagar, maybe from somewhere in Punjab or something. They will go around the Himalayas, use the Himalayas as a shield, and then enter Pakistani airspace and take out the reactor. So a bunch of F-16s with F-15s for protection, that sort of thing. And this almost went ahead once or maybe on a couple of occasions. But the Americans intervened and told, I don't know what they told the Israelis, but the Israelis pulled out of this entire mission, this project. So what we don't know what was discussed between the Americans and the Israelis. I don't know. We don't know what the Americans told the Israelis and what promises the Israelis extracted or did not. But there was the end of it. And after that, there was no Indian attempt to take out the reactor in Kahuta, and the Israelis stayed out of the matter. So it looks like they got an assurance. It looks like the Israelis got an assurance from the US that Pakistani nuclear weapons will never be used against you. Okay. Now, That's what apparently happened. That's what I think happened. And today, even today, 2025, there's a question mark on what is the real relationship between Israel and Pakistan. The Pakistanis condemn Israel. We know they do. That Israel is this or that or whatever, and what they're doing in Gaza is reprehensible and terrible and all that. But do they ever take any actual action against Israel? I have always, for the past I don't know how many years, emphasizing the difference between words and actions. Just condemning something verbally makes no difference in the world. It's just a bunch of words. It doesn't hurt a nation. The Pakistanis have never done anything that can actually hurt Israel's interests ever, right? So the question is, what is the relationship between Pakistan and Israel today? Pakistan is a US vassal. That's a US client state. Ever since Imran Khan was ousted and thrown into jail, and whoever else came to office, ever since that day, Pakistan is firmly a US vassal. Okay? And the US is Israel's number one supporter. So one is the US vassal, and one is the US's number one ally. So clearly, these two, the vassal and the ally, cannot be enemies. Makes no sense. My question is today, as of today, 2025, what is the relationship between Israel and Pakistan? I'll assure you, the two nations, we know that they don't have diplomatic relations, diplomatic ties, but I assure you there'll be some track to track three diplomacy going on at some levels between the two nations. So it's a complicated world, it's a complicated relationship. And the Israelis have been given the assurance that Pakistani weapons, Pakistani nukes will never ever be used against them in any circumstances. If that assurance was not there, and if the Israelis did not believe the assurance, they would have taken out Pakistan's nuclear weapons power program at the first possible opportunity, which was in the early 80s. And they would not have tolerated Pakistan becoming an actual demonstrated nuclear weapons power. They would not have tolerated that. They know it will now be used against them. They have that assurance.